Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Pearson Center. This is, we've lost count of how many webinars we've been doing since this pandemic started, but it's been a great way for us to reach more people. And A, they get to know about us, and B, they get to do a real deep think on some great topics that are affecting Canadians. Tonight, we're talking about the US election, polarization, and its impact on Canada. And we are delighted to have a couple of people leading this discussion with us. One of them is very familiar, and we're delighted to have him join because he's going to help moderate our session with our special guest from the United States, a fellow who isn't a stranger to the Pearson Center. Dr. Justin Gest has been with the Pearson Center in the past. Last time we were on University Avenue in downtown Toronto with a great group of people from the Pearson Center, and we were so delighted with the discussion that we've kept in touch ever since. And thanks so much to our own Premier, Dalton McGuinty, who's once again organized to bring Dr. Gest to speak with the Pearson Center and all of our people tonight on this webinar. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Gest. One, he's a great author, but he started out at Harvard, and now Justin Gest is an associate professor of policy and government at George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government in Washington, D.C. He studies immigration and the politics of demographic change. He's an author of 5 books, and one that we really got into and hopefully very relevant for tonight's discussion, The New Minority: White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality. So he provides ongoing commentary for networks, for news publications and outlets, and we're delighted that he's giving us some time today to talk about what, well, a lot of us talk about every day, the impact of US politics on Canada and the many facets of Canada and our society. Let me just say a special welcome to Premier Dalton McGuinty. He was our Premier starting in 2003. He's been my boss since about 1996. And I still think when I talk, I sort of have to pay attention because he's still my boss. But he was elected to the Ontario legislature in 1990, went on through opposition into government and led our party as Premier for years. He really was ahead of his time in so many of the policies that he brought into play in Ontario. And we're still watching how it unfolds today. Let me say a special welcome to Dalton McGuinty, and over to you. Just a quick reminder for people who may have questions for our audience tonight or for our guests, please check that question box and send them in. Andrew Cardozo is going to be joining us towards the end, and he's going to help moderate the questions that are coming from the audience. So once again, welcome to the Pearson Center. Thanks, Dalton.
Thanks very much, Sandra. Justin, great to have you. Thanks so much for taking the time. You're a busy guy. I know that you have been working on a number of things, including a proposal that you hope will catch the eye of the Biden administration. I'm going to come back to that, of course, but I think one thing I would add about you, Justin, that isn't Sandra didn't make obvious is that you may have heard the old joke about the old professor who says universities would be great places if they could just get rid of the students. And I want viewers to know that Justin has on 2 occasions been celebrated for his excellence in teaching at Harvard University.
Thanks.
And more recently at Mason University. And so you're more than just an accomplished academic, publisher, author, speaker, but you're a great teacher. And that makes you a bit of a Renaissance guy in the university setting. So it's good to have you with us.
Thanks so much, Dalton. It's great to be here.
Pleasure, pleasure. You know, we just learned, I think it was yesterday or today, that Canada's top Google search in 2020 was not coronavirus. It was US election, right? And I'm reminded of a question that my father would yell at us from the top of the stairway when me and my brothers and sisters were running around in the basement and making too much noise and banging into too many walls. And the question was, what the hell is going on down there?
Yeah.
So we're delighted to have the opportunity to chat with you and to get a better understanding. And you know, there's just too much waterfront for us to cover, but you bring some special expertise on the white working class and the role they've been playing in U.S. politics. And I wonder if we might begin by you giving us just a brief primer. Who is the white working class? Who makes up this group of people? Where are they? And how did they ever evolve to become such a powerful political force?
Yeah, these are good questions, and they're important questions, Dalton. Thank you again for hosting me, for inviting me, and thank you to the audience for joining us. It's always a pleasure to be with the Pearson Center and to get to share some of my thoughts with you all and hear some of yours. You know, the white working class really depends on your definition, but the most accepted definition these days are people who self-identify as white, and people in terms of their ethnicity and race, and people who have not completed a university education. And so if you take that definition, and some people will look at income and cultural factors too, but that's the most conventional. And if you take that definition, in terms of where are white working class people in the United States, they're everywhere. You know, this is an enormous demographic that makes up around 40% of the country, actually. So it's a very large group of people in the United States. It's an even larger share of Britain. It's a large share of Canada. It's a large share of many continental European countries. And this is a group of people who, despite their numbers, have felt very marginalized in the last few decades. And so it's really quite ironic that they have felt like this, because they hold such political power. However, both left and right have pivoted in many ways away from white working class supporters. The left has turned away from unions increasingly. The right has focused more on business community up until recently. And so, you know, this was a group that felt very much like they were untouchable by both sides, neither side particularly comfortable with their views as it aligns with their agenda. But all that changed, of course, in the age of populism and nativism that we have been experiencing over the last decade or so. And suddenly, particularly, I think, with the momentous elections of the Brexit referendum in 2016, in the summer of 2016, and then with the election of Donald Trump down south from you all here in the United States in 2016 November, that all changed, because it revealed a new model for Western democratic politics, in which the right and the far right seize the power of nativism and populism among white working class people, leverage and harvest their senses of marginality and frustration into political capital, and the rest is history.
So tell me a little bit more, Justin, about this sense of having been shunted to the side. And I guess these folks saw themselves originally as the heart of industrial America. But on the other hand, you know, I don't hear a lot, I'll try to be a little bit provocative here. I don't hear a lot of stories about white moms worrying about their white sons driving around at night and being pulled over by the police. I don't hear stories from decades gone by about white working class not being allowed into certain restaurants. I don't hear about, you know, white working class not having children who could aspire to become part of the influential class in the U.S. So how did this sense of loss of position, I guess, in society, how did that come about?
Well, I think that you know, this is the real paradox and the tension that makes this group so perplexing for so many people who observe them. You know, this is the quintessential insider group in many ways. They benefit from what you know, observers have called the invisible wages of whiteness, the structural advantages of our societies, and yet, despite being the insiders, they feel like they're on the outside. Despite having certain advantages that people of color and immigrant origin could never possess, they feel like they are the ones who are disadvantaged. In many cases, they feel discriminated against on the basis of being white and of being poor, precisely for the reasons in some ways that you mentioned. What's your excuse for being poor? You're white. This is the kinds of things that they sense, and the elitisms that they sometimes associate with these remarks. Now, that said, the reason, you know, the way we can understand the way they feel is that so much of this is about relative deprivation. It's about a relative sense of loss. It's not about, objective disadvantage when you put this in relationship to the disadvantage, the structural disadvantage that has been endured by African American communities in the United States, by our Asian American communities in the United States, by Latinos in the United States. It's not about objective deprivation. What it's about is the sense of lost status, lost wealth, lost political power. And many white working class people, and many white people more broadly, actually, and according to my research, feel a sense of that loss, that they have or have a lot of catching up to do effect. So that is really the source of that feeling of disadvantage and deprivation that perplexes so many people.
So how could a guy like Donald Trump, a wealthy guy from downtown New York City,
he says he's
find a
wealthy.
way, find a way to make a connection, a strong connection with the white working class right across the country, and particularly in rural areas? What was that all about?
It's easy. So few people have tried. This is a group of people, in many cases, who have felt ignored by many, many politicians over the decades. They lost a lot of political clout with the collapse of industry, with the collapse of unions, with the collapse of associationalism in their communities, with the mass exodus of small towns into urban cities, and they feel forgotten. And then here comes a politician, independent of his personal profile, who actually said, I care about you. To the extent that that's sincere, people can argue, but he certainly said it, and that mattered, and that opened their ears. And the truth is, very few politicians heretofore have said that. And so, I think that the bar was actually quite low. And that's how Donald Trump was able to make that happen. It also just so happens that Donald Trump, in many ways, culturally aligns with a lot of the views and perspectives. His instincts align quite well with many of the folks that I have interacted with in the course of my field work, and with some of the public opinion that I've observed in my surveys.
Yeah, I recall Donald Trump in his campaign at one point saying, it struck me, but in some ways it's a terrible genius at work. He said, "I like poorly educated people."
Yeah.
And I think one of the messages he was sending, they mean they don't even see you. I see you, I acknowledge you, and I want to champion you. When was the last time the white working class had that message?
I think we talked about this a couple of years ago, and that took place in Reno, Nevada, I believe, in August of 2016. And when he said that, Dalton, I'm sure a lot of people around the country and world kind of cringed. They're like, oh, that's so awkward. Who talks, he said, I love poorly educated people. Like, that's a weird thing to say. Who says that? But if you're a poorly educated person, you think this, you ask the same question in a very different way. Who says that? When was the last time anyone's actually said that about me? And that mattered.
Right. So the white working class and the rest of the U.S. has now had the experience of 4 years of a Trump presidency.
Mm.
So have, as Reagan said, so are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Is the white working class better off today in a measurable way, or is it do they feel better about themselves possibly as a result of being put on the map?
Yeah, and look, it depends on how we understand being better. Are they economically better? Are there prospects for material well-being any better? Are they, do they have more access to health care in the United States where it's not guaranteed? Are their lives and jobs more stable, well paid? No. But culturally, they feel like this is the most central that they have been to American politics in several generations, I think, since the mid-century. And so I think
they're now a player.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. They, as I said earlier, they matter. And so that rush to relevance is something that I don't think many of them are going to give up very quickly. And that is one of the reasons, among a variety, that you have seen a almost messianic following for Donald Trump, who can do no wrong in many people's eyes, because his politics are identity politics. You know, people tend to think about identity politics as it relates to ethnic minorities, but there are equal and strong politics associated with European origin white people or anyone who considers themselves to be white, and that's exactly what he has been playing on.
So I can recall in January of 2017, President Obama gave his farewell address, and I don't remember the words exactly, but he talked about how Atticus Finch had said that if you want to understand the man, you got to step inside his skin and walk around in it for a while. And he talked about how it's important to pay attention and to listen to those groups in America that are struggling. He talked about Blacks, refugees, immigrants, LGBTQ, trans, Hispanics. And then he said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, and if you honestly think that the middle class white American guy has got everything going for him today, then you better give your head a shake, because he's been living through a technological revolution, globalization, and a cultural disruption. So that was like a heads up 4 years ago. What happened to the blue wave?
Yeah, well, I think that in some ways these questions are connected, and in some ways they may be a little disconnected. You know, by the way, what psychologists call that Finch quote is mentalizing. You know, putting yourself in the place of someone else. Do you do that? And too few of us do, of course. And if you don't have genuine empathy for other people, it's hard to do that. You know, it's hard to put yourself in their shoes and to walk a mile in those shoes. So, you know, I think that very few people in the Democratic Party actually took that advice. I think that with the 2016 election result, I think that there were some remarkable epiphanies and realizations inside the American left about who they have been omitting, how they have misunderstood people. But I think that there was an ephemeral feeling, because when you look at the proof's in the pudding, when you look at how they campaigned thereafter, the amount of deliberate outreach to small c conservative white working class voters who left their party, left their tent, was really no different. It was minimal, no different from previous years, because of the awkward fit that they have inside of the American left today, and really the global left. You know, they just don't work as easily as they once did amongst a bunch of woke, social justice warriors and liberal cosmopolitanists, small L liberal cosmopolitanists. It's an awkward fit, and there is a very strong puritanical strain right now among the left of center and the global left that doesn't want those folks in there, even if it means that you're going to have a harder time winning nationally. They'd rather just win national. They'd rather lose than actually admit this group of people into their coalitions. And I think that that's what you saw. But at the same time, Dalton, there was a sort of mini blue wave. We saw the Democrats do very well in the 2018 midterm elections. They won a number of what the Canadians and British would call by-elections, I think, in 2017 and 2019, in a variety of ridings and gubernatorial seats here in the United States. And those victories were not victories by the far left fringes of the Democrats. These were not wokesters. These were actually a lot of moderates who were flipping seats. And so to me, the results are incongruent with the decision to largely ignore a lot of moderates and until, of course, the selection and nomination of Joe Biden. But I think we'll probably get there a little later in this conversation.
So is that tent, that center left tent, is that big enough to at some point in time, through some efforts, to reconcile those differences of the white working class and the, for want of a better word, the woke membership in the progressive wing?
Yeah, the American left has always been a very heterogeneous group. They've always had a pretty big tent. So that's not really, that wouldn't be anything new. What's become new is the sort of tolerance for disagreement, the tolerance for people who believe in gun rights or who are anti-abortion inside the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party used to have a number of those folks, and that's just basically been purged as the politics of the United States have shifted onto axes that are more cultural than economic in nature. And so, I think that there certainly is space in there, but there has to be a will. And, truthfully, that ship may have sailed now. There are two types of Trump voters, and this is something that I wrote in a Politico piece a couple of years ago about, the likelihood of winning back Trump voters who are white working class who switched parties to vote for him back in 2016. There's two types. One is the sort of messianic group that I mentioned. These are people who I call the nationalists, for just as a conventional word for them. These are dyed-in-the-wool Trumpists. You're not going to win those folks back. He's a long time coming for those folks. But there are another group of people who I interacted a lot with when I was doing my field work in Youngstown, Ohio, and not too far actually from Ontario, just across the lake. And these folks I call the exasperated, because they have voted left, they have voted right, they've abstained, they've not voted at all, they've protested, they've yelled and screamed, and no one seems to pay attention for decades. And they voted for Donald Trump as a sort of a gamble. There wasn't a sort of messianic attachment to him. They saw his flaws. He was a rich guy from New York in the way you just described. He was a snake oil salesman to them in many ways. He was just another politician to stand in front of a big, old shuttered plant or factory and say, I'm going to open these doors again for you. They've seen that before. So they were looking at him circumspect. And I think that those folks were winnable and persuadable again with some effort, with running the right candidates, saying the right things, and really, heartfelt effort into policymaking that appealed to this demographic of people. But I'm just not sure that was done.
Right. So yeah, you talk about how things have changed. And originally the Democrats, I guess the white working class had a home with the Democrats, and then because of the union support, I think largely, and then there was a drift, and Republicans didn't fill that vacuum. Trump comes to the plate. And I think the other thing that has changed that we need to acknowledge, Justin, is the fact that because of technology and through social media, we've dramatically enhanced our capacity to retreat into these echo chambers, to reduce common understanding, to enhance rancor, division, animosity. So this brings me to the healer in chief, President-elect Joe Biden. What does he have to do to reach out to the white working class and make them feel included, that they've got a place and that they've got a bright future before them?
Well, President-elect Biden is already saying the right things. This is a powerful rhetoric that you're hearing from him that demonstrates a deliberate concern with unifying the country and with breaking with what has happened from the White House, what has been coming from the White House for the last 4 years, where the extent to which you supported Donald Trump determined his interest in actually helping you with your political and policy problems. Biden wanted to make sure that there was a clean break and a really stark contrast. And so, you've heard that from Joe Biden. He has made a clear emphasis. It was true for the last few months of the campaign run, and it's been probably the most powerful theme that has emerged from his transition over the last month. However, at some point, Dalton, the poetry of the campaign must turn into the prose of practice. And Joe Biden is going to govern the country, and governing is a lot harder to do than getting up on the stump, as I know you know better than anyone. So, eventually he's going to have to make hard decisions that upset some people. And he needs to build a rapport with people who are going to disagree with him so that they understand that not every battle is existential. That we can disagree and still be friends, that we can disagree and still work together the next time, that we can disagree and still find ways of compromising in the future. And it's about the way you lead, I think, and the agenda that you pursue. And my hunch right now, and this is just from indications and rumblings from newspapers and the rumor mill, but it seems like Biden is poised to seek out consensus building policymaking first, ways of actually extending his arms out to moderates, to folks who could be persuadable to listen, to compromise with him and to support him. He's going to aim for those exasperated folks too. And that would be infrastructure bills, that would be COVID-19 healthcare provision, that would mean economic recovery and relief packages and stimulus packages. These are the kinds of things I think a lot of Americans can get around without feeling threatened. And they also completely circumvent the divisive culture wars that have been Trump's flavor of the week for the last 4 years that have proven so divisive.
Right. I was thinking you could say that Americans today are resident in the same country, but they're living in different worlds, right? The divisions are so deep, Justin. I'm just, I sometimes wonder what happened to common purpose, what happened to community, what happened to the notion that we're in this together, we're at our best together. It's important that we build a future that is going to benefit all of us. What happened to that? Is it possible to recapture that?
Well, we've diversified, and by just diversified, I don't just mean in the conventional sense of ethnically or religiously diversified. I also mean economically. Inequality is a powerful social phenomenon as well as economic phenomenon. And we are, and this is not just true in the United States. I think this is true quite globally now, with the exception of maybe some Scandinavian countries. We are living different existences because we have access to different resources. We are subject to different levels of stability in our family life. We are subject to different religious backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, and that was always true. But there was something unifying that brought us together, and sometimes that was a common struggle, a common pursuit, a common enemy. And right now, it's not clear what that is. And every identity needs to have a sense of shared moral purpose, a sense of something you have in common with each other, and the moral scaffolding that holds that upright an otherwise unwieldy population of people as diverse and enormous as the United States. And that is Joe Biden's challenge. And this is something that I think about quite frequently, but we have to be creative in terms of drafting, the first go at what does this American identity look like for the 21st century? Because it's very clear right now that the one that has unified the country over the last century has really started to run out of gas.
Justin, one of the things I came to understand through my time in public life was that people, especially those with the greatest stake in the future, parents, will put up with a lot of crap. And they'll make sacrifices and they'll do whatever is necessary. But if you tell them their kids can't get ahead, that's a serious issue. And I think that the growing inequality gap, Putnam has talked about the development of kind of a social caste system in the US where the socioeconomic context into which you are born now predetermines how you're going to end up later in life. So that's pretty challenging. But tell me a little bit about what because I do want to talk about your National Unity Council, and I think it's also a good time for us to talk a little bit about what lessons that this might have for Canada. So first, because I don't think we need a National Unity Council in Canada. I think we have a different identity, we have a different heritage, we have a different aspiration when it comes to multiculturalism. And the other thing, it's not just an add-on here, Justin. It's not a nice to have. It's part of our essence. In fact, it's the law. I think we were the first country to have a multiculturalism policy. Back in '71, that was our Prime Minister Trudeau, a Liberal Prime Minister, a father. And then in 1988, a Conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, passed the Multiculturalism Act. Having said that, we've always got some challenges. But what lessons should we draw from what went wrong in the US?
Well, demographically, Canada is not all that behind the United States in terms of its demographic transformation. I personally attribute a lot of the sort of political instability, the polarization that we're witnessing here in the United States to some degree of backlash and anxiety about demographic change. And that change is very much on the way in Canada. You have a larger share of foreign-born individuals in the Canadian population than we have in the United States. It's actually not even that big in the United States. We're about 13-14% immigrant origin in the United States today. Switzerland's at 30%. Australia is around 29-30. It's not actually that high relative to other places in the United States, but Canada is somewhere in between the two. And the Canadians are very much in the same category as a country that is on path to becoming a majority minority state, majority minority society, and certainly a number of cities already are majority minority. But it's different when the whole country is, and that's where we're heading in the United States too. But I disagree, actually. I'm not going to come on the Pearson Center's platform and tell Canucks what to do with their government. But what I will say is that a Council for National Unity, which is something that I've advocated that the Biden administration consider opening at the White House. The idea behind it is that we cannot leave the construction of national identity, the creation of shared moral purpose, the objective of unifying a diverse and diversifying population up to chance. We cannot leave it up to markets and internet algorithms, which will silo us further and cut us off from each other. We have to be proactive, and our governments have to take the mantle and some ownership over doing just that, over bringing people together. And if we don't do that, then we are really throwing caution to the wind and allowing markets and algorithms, and in some cases, opportunistic politicians who are thinking only about short-term gain to divide us. So I think it's important that governments build an infrastructure to consider what unifies the country, to bring people together, to bridge, to build a sense of social and institutional trust and maintain it. And I think that in some ways, Dalton, the creation of this infrastructure of multiculturalism, and you also have a minister of multiculturalism, of course. I've actually met, well, he was the minister of multiculturalism once before, and this is the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about, actually. Right. So in some ways, Canada already has built some of the infrastructure. So a Council for National Unity is a good idea, I think, for Canada, but it's just you guys are a bit further ahead in its creation. But you can't rest on your laurels.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that I just happen to be watching, the Comey rule these days and reliving the incredulity which characterized the notion that Donald Trump could ever become president of the United States, and things obviously went off track there. So tell me, this National Unity Council, Justin, would that be run out of the White House?
Well, I don't know. The way I pitched it in an opinion piece for CNN was that yes, it would sit inside the White House, and it would start off as being created by an executive action, and then it could be put into statute by a congressional bill and into law. That was the vision that I had, and the idea is that it could do a variety, take on a variety of initiatives to help bring Americans back together again. But yeah, it would sit in the White House. But one of the purposes, I think, and one of the initiatives would be to actually proliferate it, to actually see a national unity council or some sort of unity council at the level of American states, at the local level, and municipalities. City halls should have them too, because I don't think there is any kind of level that's too local to be considering how close, how connected we are to our neighbors and to people who are different from us when it's so easy to be atomized.
Yeah. Is there a well, let's be realistic and practical. Is there any appetite, receptivity for that kind of social infrastructure?
Yeah, I think there is actually. I think that people recognize that the sense of American identity, the sense of American unity has lapsed. And so, for those who actually believe in government and its capacity to solve collective action problems, I think that they see a pathway here. In fact, a young man from Columbus, Ohio, reached out to me after the CNN opinion piece went out, and he said, "I'd like to create a national unity council here in Franklin County. Would you advise us on how to do that?" I said, "Of course, I'd be happy to." Not knowing much about Franklin County, but I can certainly talk a little bit about how we can break boundaries and what we're doing right and wrong right now. And just on Monday, Bloomberg reported that President Biden, President-elect Biden, has given the mandate to the Office of the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, which will be run by Congressman Cedric Richmond starting in January, that he has given them a mandate to conduct outreach to Republicans, to conservatives. And so we are starting to see not only, I think, the fruit of these kinds of ideas, but incremental steps forward in a way that put the rhetoric of the campaign into practice.
Well, it reminds me of an interesting experience I had when I was premier. I traveled to a place like India or China, and they would say, it's hard to understand you people in Canada. You're so different from us. And then I'd visit the Maritimes in Canada, and they'd say, you people in central Canada, you're hard to understand. You're different from us. Then I'd go to Northern Ontario, and they'd say, the people in Southern Ontario, I don't really get them. Then you come to Ottawa, and people in Ottawa say, I don't get the people in Toronto. You go to the suburbs of Toronto, the GTA, and they say, well, we don't get the people living in downtown Toronto. So there is this human propensity to focus on what we have by way of differences. And I think principled, progressive, visionary leadership has a responsibility to recognize that and to put in place whatever measures are necessary to help ensure we understand what it is that we have in common. Again, when I was traveling to these different places, if I had the chance to speak to, again, those people with the greatest stake in the future, parents, and ask them what was most important, they all had the same answer. They would all say, well, I want a good education for my kids. I want good healthcare for everybody in the family. I want an economy that's going to support a good job for me. I want to live in a safe, secure, healthy community. And ideally, I'd like to live in a world of peace. Not many people are against those fundamental aspirations. And I think the responsibility of leadership, again, is to help us understand we share that. Otherwise, we can be torn asunder.
Absolutely, and there are policy issues inside, just beneath those broad concepts and phenomena that transcend the various lines that divide us today. Student debt or any kind of debt, frankly, doesn't see black, brown, or white. The need for accessible healthcare or good schools does not discriminate. And these are this is the fodder for unifying people behind key agendas The question, of course, is how you plan on dealing with it. For a future book that I'm preparing right now, it should be out next year, late next year. I'm studying a variety of majority-minority societies that have already passed the threshold, and I'm interested in what they do.
Is that just so our folks understand, Justin? You mean that a group that was formerly constituted a majority is now become a minority?
Precisely. So a majority-minority society is a society in which the ethnic majority of the country has lost its numerical advantage to one or more ethnic minorities, groups that were previously in the minorities. And usually and I study them in places where those are immigrant origin minorities rather than two indigenous groups that are kind of vying for power over the same territory. I don't study ethnic conflict. So this is an immigration derived phenomenon. And so I look at societies where immigration has led to great demographic transformations. And it's interesting because the same kind of policy areas, the same kind of actions by government can really pivot a country towards reconciliation or towards more conflict and contestation. And just as some examples, commerce. When you have a meritocratic, equal status, equal standing economy, where people are interdependent on one another and are working with one another, have access, have contact with one another, it's a wonderful tool towards reconciliation. But when you have an economy where that's ossified, where people are stuck in place, that's not meritocratic, where it's cronyist, or where you have a segmented labor market where certain types of people do certain types of things, that's not good for reconciliation. Another example is a sense of threat. How do you create a sense of threat? Because many countries often feel threatened. Is it an external sense of threat, or do you identify sources of threat from internally, from inside of your country? Culture unites and culture divides. All of the major political issues that have shredded the United States social cohesion over these last 20 years have been cultural in nature. And yet, you take a look at the Toronto Raptors, and I bet all those folks from Prince Edward Island all the way to BC were pulling for them pretty hard. And that's the nature of culture and cultural products: art, music, theater, sports. It brings people together and it crosses boundaries by speaking a language that transcends those boundaries. And so, the kind of policies that oversee these things and create initiatives and fund them really are pivotal, actually, for bridging these divides. And so, I do think that this is all an argument for the place that government has to identify ways to bring people closer to one another and to create that sense of unity, even if you don't necessarily know where it's going to take you. The proximity of the people to one another, the sense of connectedness between one countryman and one countrywoman to another, that is what matters. And it takes you where it takes you, but you can't go wrong when you have connectedness.
So, Justin, do you think that the Biden administration, number one, understands the issues that we've been approaching here this evening, that they get their intractability, but are prepared to spend some political capital nonetheless?
Yes, I do. I think that more than any incoming administration that I have witnessed, I think they do. Bill Clinton was a very skilled politician who actually performed very well electorally with white working class populations. And, I think that he was very sensitive and came from a very white working class state in Arkansas. But at the time, they weren't his opposition. They were his supporters. So his sensitivity to them was as constituents rather than as potential opponents. And so, I think that there is a keen awareness among Joe Biden and his staff about what they're up against. And it's remarkable because, he won pretty substantially. There a few states were pretty close, Arizona and Georgia, as I'm sure you all observed in Canada. But he won pretty substantially, and he won a very substantial majority, I think, in terms of the
8 million votes, right? 8 million votes?
I think it was 5 million votes. I might be wrong, but I think it was 5. And but that's a substantial lead. over a country this big. And so, he could just, be complacent, but instead he's very conscious of the folks who voted against him and the persistence of Trumpism in American society.
Right. Andrew.
Thank you, Dalton, and thank you, Justin. Fascinating stuff so far. We've got a number of questions, so I'll try and go through them quick. And Dalton, feel free to join in as we go through these. So the first is, what are the early warning signs of polarization, and what can we do to prevent it?
Yeah, these are good questions. I think that the kind of polarization, I'm just going to narrow the question down to the area that I think I can be most helpful about. The kind of polarization that most concerns me is the kind where your parties become racialized, where partisan politics become proxies for racial or ethnic conflict. And I think that is something that is beginning to happen in the United States. If you are an ethnic minority in the United States, you are strongly likely to be supporting the Democratic Party. If you are a Republican in the United States, you are highly likely to be white. That doesn't mean that it's a sufficient condition to be a Republican, but it just means that most Republicans very heavily are of white racial backgrounds. That's unhealthy for democracy, because what happens is that your loyalty to a tribe is superseding your loyalty to the country. It makes you less, because these proxy battles of politics, whether the most trivial issues, they feel like they are existential in nature. They're proxy battles for an existential conflict, which means people are less likely to compromise and more likely to break the rules in order to win. And so I think that, and that is a grave situation, but it's one I think that's confronting the United States, because in many cases, I see the United States going the way of a country like Trinidad and Tobago or Guyana in some cases, which have very racialized political parties in demographically divided countries. I would also just point to compromise. When compromise is intolerable to one side in the interest of actually getting something done, that's also a very bad sign for the extent of polarization, because it just leads to paralysis.
Let me just throw on top of that, I agree with everything Justin said. I think from a Canadian perspective, we're always going to have, I think, hopefully only a limited number of folks who we might describe as extremists. That will always be there. I think the challenge would come if mainstream political parties, Andrew, began to take up those causes and to champion them. That would become an issue. Right now, our mainstream political parties have shied away from that, and I think have acted responsibly by so doing.
Yeah. So the next question kind of takes this a little further. Black Lives Matter has outlined a clear and aggressive agenda for change. Does addressing this cause the white working class to turn away? So I guess this is a question that the Biden administration will face.
Yeah, I think that they have, but I think it's about articulating what that agenda is, because when you're a movement or when you're a social movement like that, particularly one as broad-based as Black Lives Matter, you can project onto it what you want, and what are the steps that need to be taken. I unfortunately, I think the response to Black Lives Matter protest have been a sort of case in point of the lack of empathy, the lack of connectedness that I fear that's sort of rampant in the United States right now. Is that basically you have people who are competing for a sense of vulnerability. You have people competing for who has it worse off, because that's in many ways what you hear from those who are trying to contest the claims of the Black Lives Matter organizers and campaigners and protesters. And to me, that is just such a shame, because no one wins those debates. We just talk past each other. We don't actually recognize the struggle of the other. We don't actually recognize their vulnerability and how maybe actually our shared sense of vulnerability isn't that different. And certainly there are going to be people who are going to point out that the vulnerability and the disadvantage that Black Lives Matter campaigners are pointing to is exponentially different and driven into a deep history of the United States and our laws and our society, and they wouldn't be wrong. But politics is about perception, and lecturing at angry white folks who are counter protesting you about how that invalidates their claims is not going to be a way to find that compromise, to find a sense of mutual listening and shared empathy. And that's the challenge I think that these groups face.
And how does the government straddle those two, or bring those two sides at least to understand each other?
I think this is where some kind of government infrastructure that facilitates unity is so important, because you can't just, move from screaming your lungs out at each other on the streets of Minnesota to, coming together at the bargaining table and, hashing something out. I mean, that's just preposterous. There is no trust right now between these groups. There's no sense of rapport. You have to create some sense of connectedness, some kinds of bond, something in common to mutually recognize each other first, before you can actually think about taking steps, incremental steps, baby steps towards actually working together. And that's just not being done.
And Dalton, your thought about how you bridge those kind of differences in different areas, different policy fields when you were premier?
Well, it's tough going, just on the American scene, on the one hand, you've got the white working class looking back longingly, and you've got other racialized minorities looking ahead, hopefully. They're heading in different directions. And then they're caught up in this matrix of social media toxicity, makes it exceptionally difficult to reconcile those challenges. But you've got to find something in common. You've got to go back to ground. And I talked about some of those common aspirations, and you've got to find a way to reinforce those. I think, Andrew, most of the forces in life are designed to take us apart and set us off in different directions. You grew up and left your mom and dad, the people who invested all of their heart and sacrifice in raising you. You leave them. We abandon them. That's in the natural order of things. We tend to pull away, and we've got to find ways to remind people of what it is that we share, because there are too many people out there seeking to divide us and reinforce what we have by way of differences.
Yeah, Justin, you've written about nostalgic deprivation in this regard. Is that relevant here?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned to Dalton about the sense of lost wealth, lost status, and lost power, because that sense of loss is all backward looking. And nostalgia consumes so many white working class people, which is why Donald Trump's throwback, "Make America Great Again," was so resonant. Right now, many white working class people don't actually, I think, see a future that they look forward to. And I think that's why the hope is actually in regressing to a past that was far more comfortable, at least from their perspective today. There's a lot of rose-tinted lenses when you look in hindsight. And I think that's absolutely as true here as any other time. But no doubt, progressives are shoving their constituents into the future, onward, without really necessarily making sure everyone's comfortable with that future. And basically, what you have in the radical right and in the American conservatives is an attempt to hit the brakes really hard. As an example of this, by the way, Tony Blair's speech, I always reference the 2005 Labor conference speech. He said, people want to have a debate about globalization, but having a debate about globalization is like debating whether autumn should follow the summer. And the idea, of course, the implicit move from Blair at the time was, I'm not debating this, it's inevitable, get over it, move on, let's go, into the future we go. And that was not comforting to people who felt like they were on the raw end of globalization's very sharp edges.
Yeah. Justin, another question for you. Conspiracy theories had a major impact in this election. How do you deal with groups like QAnon who refuse to admit reality?
Well, look, I don't think that that Joe Biden sees QAnon supporters or believers or members as persuadable. I don't think he sees them as movable. So I don't think they're going to be a very strong focus of the administration and their public outreach. I don't think they're going to be on the Christmas card list of the Office of Public Engagement. However, I think that we have to understand conspiracy theories for what they are. They're cries for help, I think, in many ways. They are a sense of helplessness. They come from a sense of helplessness. When you don't feel like you have a sense of agency over the reality that you are confronted with, it is a lot easier to believe that there is a conspiracy against you somehow or against your agenda, because something is against you and you're not quite sure what it is, and you don't feel like you have any proactive ability to do something about it. There's a David Brooks column in the New York Times from about 2 weeks ago, and he kind of pathologizes this sense of helplessness, but I think it's still a very interesting observation that when you have information that is from a conspiracy theory that only you have and everyone else is denying, it reinforces a sense, or it gives you a sense of centrality that you are yearning for. And so many of these folks are yearning for that sense of centrality amidst their marginality.
And what do you see happening with Donald Trump over the next 4 years? Does he keep being a force in American politics?
Oh, he'll look. Trumpism is definitely going to outlast Donald Trump. I think that's very clear. I don't read into his performance, I think, as much as others do, because Republicans and Democrats, Americans only had two choices in the 2020 election, really, right? So just because people voted for Donald Trump doesn't mean that they are with him forever, and that they believe everything he says and want everything that he wants. But I do think that if you look at polling and public opinion about him, it's undeniable that there's a lot of allegiance, and he will also have a lot of control institutionally over the Republican Party. I think that one of the natural moves for Donald Trump is going to be in the media space, whether it's with a Fox News or on his own network or something. Who knows? I obviously know as much as you guys might know. But the media is ubiquitous and it keeps you relevant when, in fact, you don't have any power, political power. It's, or I should say, institutional power when you're out of government. And so that could be a really important platform for him to stay in people's living rooms and be a very niggling sideshow on the fringes of the Biden administration, which it wouldn't be that different from the birther movement, which began in 2012, I believe, during the Obama administration.
Okay, we are out of time, but I just have a quick question for both of you. How likely is it that we in Canada could get a politician like Trump, and what do we do if it happens? So Justin, Gest, you go first.
I'll go first. This would be very speculating, but to project the future, I think you should always check out the past, the rearview mirror, and trends. And I think you've already had a very similar figure in Rob Ford. I think that there are obviously differences, but no two politicians are alike. You look at far right politicians and populists and nativists in Europe, and they may be Trump inspired, or maybe they inspired Trump, but they're not all the same. But they're certainly similar. And Trump is in some ways actually easier to caricature than some of the more complex populists that you see in Europe, such as Thierry Gaudet in the Netherlands, who is a skinny suit wearing PhD. He's got more degrees than Dalton does back there, and reads the classics. So and he's their far right leader. So there's a lot of different breeds of far right politics these days.
Yeah, and Dalton, your thoughts? Could it happen here?
I may be a little bit more optimistic than Justin in this regard, but maybe that's just my natural predisposition. Having said that, we can never take our democracy or the quality of our democracy or the quality of our leaders for granted. And I think that we're more vulnerable than we ever have been, not because of demographic changes, not because we have, and I think rightly, an aggressive immigration policy, but because social media and a continuing loss of faith in traditional institutions makes us more vulnerable. So I think we're going to need leaders who bring, in what I would wish for President-elect Biden, dignity, grace, a sincere reverence for the office, decency. We need to continue to expect those fundamentals from all our leaders.
Okay, thank you. I just want, before I sign off, I just want to tell our audience that this concludes our webinars for this month and for this season. We have the next one, we've had 35 to date and had about 8,000 people altogether with over 100 experts. And Justin Gest, thank you for closing us out for the season. The next session we have in January, on January the 20th at 7 p.m., we'll have Dalton McGuinty back on, and he will be back with two of his contemporaries, Premier Christy Clark of BC and Premier Bernard Lord of New Brunswick, who all served together at the time that Dalton was in office. And they will be talking about the big challenges that Canada faces, and with their wisdom, having been in the leader's chair, we'll be talking about their ideas for how Canada should be dealing with our big challenges. With that, a sincere thank you to you, Professor Justin Gest, for returning to the Pearson podium. And I think we've enjoyed this so much. We're going to take you up on your sense that you like coming here and say we'll have you back again.
Love it.
Thank you for doing it today. Dr. McGuinty, really good to see you again and have you take us through this conversation today. With that, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Justin.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
You
Happy
take
holidays.
care.
I know.